advance, but we'll try to deal with it. All right, so welcome to the talk that I'm about to give on the Great American Eclipse. My name is Matthew Pappas. I'm a professor in the Earth and Space Science Department here on this campus. This is an eclipse that astronomers, at least in the United States and the world over, have been waiting for quite some time. I love telling the story about a certain map that I tend to use in my classes, and I've been using it for about 15 years now, showing the eclipses that happen on sort of a year-to-year basis. And I've been talking about this eclipse for those 15 years, and lo and behold, in short order, it's upon us. And it's just amazing how quickly the time flies. So the whole point of my giving this presentation for you guys today was to maybe teach you a little bit about what goes on with an eclipse, why eclipses happen only certain times when the moon is in the right position in its orbit. So I'll give you a little bit of background of the proper alignment that needs to happen. And then we'll go into what we can expect to see for a total eclipse, particularly for Long Islanders and other people across the country. And I'll talk a little bit about some safe viewing techniques that you can take advantage of. So if at any moment you have questions, please just let me know. We can treat it more in an informal manner. I'm happy to answer questions as we go. Okay. All right. So in order to understand anything about eclipses, the first thing we have to realize is that realize how shadows are cast when the sun shines its light on objects within the solar system. And it turns out that every shadow that is cast by the sun actually has two distinguishable parts. And I don't really feel like getting into the geometry of it. I don't think anybody really needs to get all the background geometry of how the light intersects the Earth or the moon at different angles, slightly different angles, producing these two shadows. I think we're satisfied, hopefully, with understanding that the shadow that gets cast by the Earth or the moon or anything else in the solar system has a part that is really dark and centralized. It's a part that is referred to as the umbra, and I like to describe it as a cone-shaped shadow that starts at the Earth and then narrows out to a point the farther away you get from the Earth. So it's almost as if the Earth is sitting on top of the ice cream cone, so to speak. And that part of the shadow, like I said, is really dark. There's a peripheral shadow, a shadow that starts at the Earth and widens out as you increase the distance from the Earth. And that shadow tends to be lighter in its shading. You know, I hate to use the word color because there is no color in this darkness, so it's a little bit lighter in its shading. And that part of the shadow is called the penumbra. So the reason why we need to understand that there are these two different shadows is because what kind of eclipse we're capable of seeing is going to depend on what part of the shadow is hitting what part of the other object that's included in the scenario. So for this scenario, since we're talking about a solar eclipse, the three objects that are going to be of interest is the light source, the sun, the object that's going to block out that light source, the moon from our perspective, and us being on the Earth, the observers. Okay? Now, certain things need to happen simultaneously. A couple of things need to happen simultaneously in order for an eclipse to happen. And both of those things have to deal with positioning. So I think it's probably pretty clear to see that the first order of business is to make sure that the moon gets between us and the sun. So the moon does travel in an orbit around the Earth, and depending on where it is in its orbit, we're going to see a certain phase of the moon, whether it be a crescent, a quarter moon, which is oddly enough when the moon is exactly half lit. Then you've got a full moon when you've got it completely lit. In between the two, in between quarter and full moon, you've got a gibbous moon. And then the cycle of phases, reverses itself until you get to the point where the moon is no longer visible because from our perspective it is directly in line with the sun. And the name of that phase is the new moon. Okay? So the first order of business is to have the moon directly between us and the sun. So this diagram that I'm showing you here is showing you sort of both perspectives. The spaceborne perspective, looking down on the Earth traveling in its orbit. That's this long gray line, this arcing line dipping downward. And then you've got the moon in different positions in its orbit and simultaneously showing you what phase you'd expect to see. So again, when the moon is between the Earth and the sun, we really wouldn't see any part of the moon, simply, well, for two basic reasons. One, the side of the moon that's facing us is its nighttime side. It's the darkened side, so there's no light to be viewed. In addition to that, the new moon is essentially in line with the sun, so as the sun rises and sets, so does the new moon. It follows across the sky during the daytime. Now, a new moon happens at least once every month, just like there's at least one full moon every month as well. But just because there's a new moon every month doesn't mean you end up with an eclipse every month. And the reason for that is because of the second condition that needs to take place at the same time that the moon is directly between us and the sun. And that second condition is that the moon has to be crossing Earth's orbital plane at that time of new moon. And what this refers to is the fact that the moon's orbit is actually tilted compared to the Earth's orbit. They're not coplanar. They're not perfectly in line with one another. So because of this tilt right here, oftentimes what will happen, in fact, a majority of the time what will happen, is when the moon is in its new phase, in the position in the orbit where it's between us and the sun, it's not directly in line with the sun. So from our vantage point on Earth, if we could see the new moon while the alignment was happening in this scenario, we would actually see the moon slightly above the sun. Conversely, we could be in a different part of our orbit at a different time of year, and the moon would be underneath the orbital plane of the Earth. And what that would mean is, if we could see the new moon, it would be dipping underneath the sun. So again, we don't have this perfect alignment where the moon is exactly crossing in front of the sun. So what needs to happen, like I said, is you need to have this simultaneous alignment. When it's new moon, the moon has got to be at this tiny little point, this what's referred to as a node of its orbit. Because there are two of these positions where the moon actually crosses our orbit. They're each referred to as a node. And so when the new moon is at one of these nodes, that's when you've got that perfect alignment for where the moon can actually appear to block out the sun. So here's one perspective. I always like to throw in this sort of side view perspective again to get, kind of bring it all home together. So most of the time, the moon is either above or underneath the orbital plane, so that even though we've got a new moon happening, you're not going to end up seeing an eclipse. It's this perfect alignment where you get the blockage of the sun. Okay? Do you have any questions before moving forward?
What is the angle between the two orbits?
It's a bit over 5 degrees. I think it's like 5.2. And again, for comparison's sake, astronomers use angles to measure things in the sky. So if you want to know how far apart a couple of stars are, you could point to one star with this finger, point to another star with that finger, and say, hey, the angle between my fingers or my arms is right now about, 80 degrees. I don't know if it's a perfect 90 or not, but this is about 80 degrees apart. We could use that same idea to talk about how wide the sun and how wide the moon look. Okay? And in those terms, the sun and the moon are both only about half a degree. And a subtle little thing that I wasn't planning on mentioning, I don't have a slide for it, but it's worth mentioning, is Earth has this very interesting case, this interesting scenario where our moon, which is really, really tiny, is orbiting around us at just the right distance so that it can cover the moon can cover the sun entirely. So the sun is enormous and it's really far away, but the proportion between those sizes and distances is virtually perfect, so that we actually have this opportunity to see full coverage of the sun. And it's not always going to be that way, because what's happening between the Earth and Moon system is that there are forces acting in such a way that the Earth's rotation is slowing down a little bit over time. Little by little, it takes a little bit longer for a day to be complete. A consequence of that is the moon has to drift farther away from us in order to conserve momentum. So what's gradually happening is the moon is physically drifting away little by little, so that I don't know the number off the top of my head, but in maybe tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of years down the line, long after we're gone, the moon, when it blocks up the sun, will not do it entirely. It will only block out sort of the central part of the sun, leaving behind, or allowing us to see what's called an annular eclipse instead of a total eclipse. So if you want a nice global view of where we are in the history of our planet and the history of humanity, we're kind of fortunate where we have this event to take advantage of. Okay. So let's say we've got the situation where the moon is hitting those two conditions simultaneously. It's new moon and it's crossing our orbital plane. Then we've got the moon's shadow being able to be cast onto the surface of the Earth. And now this is where paying attention to the two different parts of the shadow is important. Where the moon's umbra, the central shadow where it's really dark, touches the Earth, that's going to create a certain region on the Earth where if you are in that location, you are going to be able to see the moon completely block out the sun for a certain amount of time. If you don't happen to live anywhere in that position, but happen to be in the peripheral shadow, then you're going to be treated to what's called a partial eclipse, where the moon will block out just part of the sun, but not the entire sun. If you are on a spot of the Earth where you're outside of that shadow, or even worse, you're just on the nighttime side of the Earth when the eclipse is happening during the day, you're not going to see anything at all. So just because an eclipse of the sun is happening doesn't mean everyone on the planet has got an opportunity to see it, including those who are on the daytime side. And the reason for this is simply because the moon's shadow is not all that big, because the moon itself is not all that big. So that shadow does not engulf the Earth. The opposite type of eclipse, the lunar eclipse, where the moon cuts through our shadow, when that happens, because our shadow is so large, anyone who is on the Earth, for the most part, has the opportunity to see a lunar eclipse when that happens, provided it's nighttime. That's really your number one issue. Okay? So, straight away, most people, and I can even survey here, who's seen a solar eclipse before? 1, 2. Who's seen a lunar eclipse? So, okay, so right there. Everyone, I think, has seen a lunar eclipse. Only 2 people have seen solar. During a person's lifetime, unless you are an avid fan of solar eclipses, there are people I've met who are sort of eclipse chasers. That's their hobby. They like to travel the world, and they save up their money to fly to exotic locations so that they can see these eclipses happening that not many people have an opportunity to see. And one of the, I can't remember his name, it was a number of years ago, it was at an event out east. He's a scientist at NASA. He and his buddy, they do this all the time. And he told a story of there was an eclipse, I think, only he and probably a couple dozen other people in the entire world were able to see it. Because the area on the Earth where you were capable of seeing it was in Europe, where this shadow actually touched down was across Europe. The entire continent was clouded out, except for this one small peak on a mountain where he happened to be in the Greek Isles. And so him and the people he was there with were the only people around to actually see that eclipse. So not a bad little claim to fame. The entire history of the world, only 24 people got to see this one eclipse, right? So some people treat it, like very seriously. And I think he's seen at least 30 or 40 eclipses in his lifetime. So where we're lucky enough to see 1 or 2, he's gone around the world and seen a whole bunch. Hold on a second. Let me reorder this. Sorry. Because I'd like to just talk about, what you're going to end up seeing here. So I can cover the slide. There we go. Sorry. Okay. So what can we expect to see if you happen to be in that area of a shadow? Now, there are a couple of different perspectives. I like this one because it's rather unique. This perspective was taken using the Deep Space Climate Observatory, which is a satellite orbiting the Earth and studying it from space. And during the total eclipse of March 9th of last year, it was in the correct position to watch the moon shadow just gradually traipse across the surface of the Earth. And so you can see what is referred to as the path of the eclipse, and more importantly, the central region where the umbra is the region of totality, or the path of totality. And so I always like this animation because it really gives that right perspective to have, particularly for my students who may have little difficulty translating perspectives to outer space, and it really shows you what we mean by this path, that the moon is constantly moving in its orbit, and as it cuts in front of the sun, the shadow just simply drags across the face of the Earth. And this only lasts from start to finish, from one edge to the other, only a few hours. And again, that depends on which eclipse we're talking about, but it's on the order of just a few hours. And again, with this still image, you can see that there's a very dark central region, and toward the edge, the shading gradually fades from view. So again, it gives another good perspective of where totality is, where the partial eclipse can be viewed, and notice that there are parts of the Earth that the shadow did not touch, right? So there are plenty of places. So back in March of last year, there were very few land-based locales that were capable of even seeing this eclipse, right? So, what does a total eclipse look like? What can you expect? So here are a couple of different perspectives. The one on the left was a photograph taken by an astrophotographer. Can't read the name. Normally I rely on the sort of copyright footnotes that are in the images, but unfortunately it's a little blurry here. This is a kind of a standard type of astrophotography technique during a solar eclipse, which is take an image of the sun just before first contact happens, meaning just before the moon really starts to even cover up the sun, and then a little while later, wait for the moon to cover up a certain percentage, then a little more, and then take a good snapshot of totality. When the moon is completely blocking out the sun, revealing a cloud of gas surrounding the sun known as its corona. This cloudy region is there all the time, but we can't see it because the light from the sun itself is so bright it drowns out the faded light from the surrounding area. Totality lasts just for a handful of minutes. Again, this is a case-by-case scenario. As far as I'm aware, the longest totality can last is about 13 minutes. Okay? So for a maximum of 13 minutes, the sun can be blocked out, and then the moon, again, traveling in its orbit, will slowly reveal the sun behind it, and then the eclipse is ended. And so here's just a separate photograph. I think I probably pulled this off of like NASA's homepage for the upcoming eclipse. Again, just sort of highlighting the fact that you can see regions of the sun you're not normally accustomed to. Particularly a region, if you can see some sort of pinkish here along the edge. So there's the light we get from the sun, normally, what you look at when you watch a sunset or a sunrise. That part of the sun is known as the photosphere, the light sphere. But there's a layer of light above that. There's a layer of gas surrounding all of that, but again, it's very thin and diffuse, and it's hard to see the light from it because it's not that bright. When you block the light from the normal photosphere of the sun that we normally see, this thin ring of light starts to appear, and it appears red. And that's where the origin of the name comes from, actually, chromosphere, meaning color sphere. Okay? And then beyond that, again, is the corona surrounding it all. So if you are in that path of totality, this is something you can expect to see, particularly if you've got proper eyewear and proper viewing equipment. During the time of totality, it is dark enough for stars to appear, which is a little weird, a little strange. The one solar eclipse that I remember quite clearly occurred back in the 1990s. I was in high school. Some friends and I, we learned that you could use a special, well, not special, welder's glass that had a certain absorption rating, I guess you would call it. And it turned out a buddy of mine, his dad worked for the high school. He was one of the groundskeepers crew, and he had the key to the shed, so we just walked in there, found the welder's goggles, saw the number, hey, this works, and we were just all holding it up to the sky and, taking it all in. But the thing I remember besides that was how sort of the ghostly aura, the lighting was just very weird for midday. You know,
that was the eclipse I remember that I was talking about. Was that a total or?
I think that was partial. At least for me up in Massachusetts.
The aurora wasn't really hitting our area.
Exactly. Yeah.
We probably had the peripheral part.
Exactly.
But it was just such an eerie feeling outside. It was like the early '90s. I remember it was like a weekday during like lunchtime or so. And
you're describing my high school days, you know, weekday, lunchtime, we were all outside, you know.
Yeah.
So yeah, totally remember clearly. And it was a good percent. I'd have to look back at the number, you know, like to see what percentage coverage. But it had to be about 70, 80%, I would imagine, because it was really just eerie looking, you know. I've heard, again, just in conversations with people, particularly biologists, they've told me that there are reports of certain species of animals, like birds and monkeys, acting very strangely during eclipses because when their bodies are just in tune to that natural rhythm of the rising and setting of the sun, and all of a sudden it gets dark out of nowhere, and the stars come out, and it's like nighttime, they just like, wait, is it time to go to bed? What's going on? And they notice a change in their behavior. One person I talked to, this was in grad school, said there were reports of the description of these monkeys that they were studying was like they were in a drunken state. They were just kind of wandering around, disoriented, and not really sure what was happening. The eclipse ends, and then after a few moments, things went back to normal. But this can have an effect on people and animals that people just don't seem to think about. They're not really aware of. Now, unfortunately, as I'll show you in the maps, we're not in the path of totality. Okay? By us, I mean Long Islanders.
For this coming one.
For this coming one. So we can expect a partial eclipse. And what a partial eclipse is, pretty straightforwardly, is when the sun just gets partially blocked. Okay? So here's just a sequence of images just to kind of give you an impression of what's going on during that scenario. The moon starts to block out the sun, but only coming across part of it from, again, your particular vantage point. Okay. So here's a map that I downloaded just to show you one particular aspect that's very interesting to note about solar eclipses, something known as the Saros cycle. And the Saros cycle was actually recognized by ancient observers thousands of years ago. The Egyptians, I think, are credited as being one of the first civilizations to make note of this. It turns out that because the Earth goes around the sun in a very cyclic way, and the moon goes around us in a very cyclic, measurable way, you will get a repetition of specific alignments. So that repetition occurs every 18 years, 11 days, and about 8 hours or so. So ancient observers, by making notes of when eclipses were happening and the dates and the times very accurately and building up that cache of data over long periods of time, they were able to pick up on this repetitive pattern. So they actually were very good at predicting when the next solar eclipse and the next lunar eclipse was expected to happen. Okay? We can do it to very high accuracy nowadays because we know the orbit of the moon very accurately and the orbit of the Earth around the sun, the timing of it all very accurately. So we can make these predictions very far in advance, and I'm about to show you in a moment how far in advance. So this is a map showing you the paths of totality for the solar eclipses that were happening from 2001 to 2020. And so you've got annular eclipses highlighted in red, which is the case where the moon doesn't block the sun entirely, but rather just the central part in a ring of sunlight is still visible off the limb, or the edge of the moon. Then you've got where the total eclipses are happening, and again, that's highlighted in blue. And just to show you an example of what I mean by the Saros cycle, here's an eclipse that occurred in Antarctica back in 2000. I'd have to, hold on. Let me take a look here. My eyes are really bad. Okay, November of, hold on. Am I about to lie to you? Hopefully not. This is a different map than what I'm used to. Sorry about that. Then maybe my other map is wrong. I have a map that has them set apart 18 years. And so I teach it all the time. Hey, look, 18 years apart. Look, Saros cycle. Now it doesn't look to be that way. Hold on. Let me see if I can get you another one. There we go. That's a better one. So maybe this is not part of the same cycle, but this one here and this one here are part of the same Saros cycle. So that's another example. So on in June of 2001, we had the path of totality cutting across the southern Atlantic, across southern Africa and Madagascar. 18 years, 11 days, and about 8 hours, the same eclipse happens. The 8-hour difference is why the eclipse happens over here. There's an 8-hour time delay. All right. So if it weren't 0.3 days or 8 hours, if it was an even 11 days, the eclipse would happen over the same location. Okay. So you get this repetitive pattern happening within certain 20-year periods. Okay. Now, our eclipse is part of Saros cycle number 145. Okay. This is a table illustrating all of the solar eclipses related to the one, or that, I don't want to say related, what's the word I want to use? The eclipse is happening this August. Is right there on the table. I know it's really tiny print, very small, hard to read all the data and the information what we can gather. But here is the information with regards to this particular eclipse. Okay? Time it starts, duration of totality, other things that I don't feel like getting into. But this eclipse is expected to happen in another 18 plus years. So in 2035, on September 2nd, there's going to be a solar eclipse. All the properties of it, where to locate it, the duration of the eclipse, time it starts, all that stuff is listed in this table. 18 years after that, 2053, there's another eclipse. All the way through the year 3009. So we've got this calculated to pretty high accuracy, and as we get closer to each one in the cycle, revisions of our measurements that may be done between now and then, because things are always being revised in such a long time span, right? Those adjustments will be added, so the timing of these events will be better known as we get closer. But this is the timing of all the expected eclipses that are tied into the one we're about to see. So this is just one of many in a repetitive cycle that occurs every 18 plus years. Okay. So where can you see totality? Now, I don't know if you saw it in the previous map in that jumbled mess of all those blue and red bars, but the one that is happening this summer is cutting across the United States. And the reason why it's being referred to as the Great American Eclipse is because the only place, as far as land masses go, that you can see the eclipse is the United States. It's not North America. It's not like the one coming up in a few years where it's going to go from Mexico through the United States up to Canada. The only place is the United States where you can see this. The path of totality is marked here, running from the Pacific Northwest all the way down to the southeast coast down through South Carolina. Unfortunately, as you can tell, the Long Island is not near there. Okay? What we can expect to see is about 70% coverage. Not bad. We're probably going to get that effect where it's going to be a little bit eerie, a little bit weird, midday sun getting blocked out.
Would it be comparable to that one in the 90s?
That's what I'm expecting. Like I said, what I would need to do is I have to go back and see what that coverage was. But in my mind, from what I remember, it's probably on par with that. I would imagine be on par with that. Okay.
Can we ever expect to see something in our area in totality in our lifetime?
No.
Okay.
When you start taking, there are maps like, hold on, this one that you can check for 2021 through 2040. And when you start looking at that, even the one that I think is coming, I think it's 2021 or 2023. The one's coming up in our neck of the woods, we're still not going to get totality. It's going to kind of come up through those sort of mid-Atlantic states, I think, if I can remember the map correctly. Maybe Ohio and that area. But we're still not going to get totality, unfortunately. Again, we just did the quick survey. How many people have seen total eclipses? Not many, right? And this is the reason why. You've got to be in the right place or travel to the right place, right? So, if you want to see the total eclipse, there's some interesting options. Nashville is almost dead center of the path of totality. And from what I hear, that's a really good, fun city to visit. Good music, good food, nice culture down there. So I just, like I said, heard lots of good things. So that's one of the possible places to visit. St. Louis is nearby. If it's not in the path, it's pretty close. Portland, Oregon is pretty close as well. Again, not within the path, but if you could find a place to stay, you could always just stay there for a few days on the day of the eclipse, go travel out to where you could actually be in the umbral shadow, and then, spend the rest of your time doing whatever you want. Portland, great town, great city. I'd highly recommend it if you've never been. The downside to that, though, is, as I mentioned before, astronomers have been waiting for this eclipse for quite some time. There are some local astronomy groups, I'm going to let you know who they are in a few moments. And by talking to some of them, they have been trying to book this for years. Hotels have been booking up since 2 or 3 years ago. And I'll let you know, businesses, they know when to make their money. They've been requiring 2-night stays, 3-night stays, deposit in full, non-refundable, jacked up prices, everything. Because they know people are going to want to flock to this, flock to their area. If you're lucky enough to find a place that hasn't been booked, kudos. But it's probably because somebody had to cancel last minute. So other options might be, if you're into camping, if you have an RV, there's some probably local places you could go to nearby, camp out, and then drive to the place of totality. That was kind of like my original idea. Some of us in the department were throwing around the idea of maybe getting together and maybe taking a road trip, but it just never came to fruition. Unfortunately, I'm not going to be around here during the eclipse. I'm going to be up in Massachusetts. I'm away on vacation that week. So you'll have a little bit better view than me. I'm going to get like 65% coverage. So, don't brag about that. All right. So here's some information for you if you want to, jot it down, or I can always send it to you, or get a print out of this or whatever. For us, the start of the eclipse is, let me see, universal time. Hold on a second. Let me show you my math correctly, is 1725, so that's 5:25. We are 5 hours. Hold on. 12. No, we're 4 hours behind UT, because universal time is like our standard time, right? So since we've added an hour for our daylight savings time, we're only 4 hours behind universal time. So the eclipse is expected to start about 1:30, maximum eclipse about 2:30, end of the eclipse about 3:30 or so, 3:30, 4 o'clock. So mid to late afternoon is about the time frame you can expect to see an eclipse. Now, one of the reasons why we had decided against planning a road trip, hold on a second, is summed up in this graph. This map. This map was published just before the beginning of the semester. This is the average cloud cover for August around 1:30 p.m. for the entire United States from 2002 to 2016. Notice the Northeast, notice the place we were thinking of traveling to is in this 60 to 70, even 80% chance of cloud cover. Okay? Right. Doesn't mean it's going to be cloudy. We know how weathermen are. My office mate is Scott Mandino. We know how it works. He's the best of them, and even he can be wrong once in a while, right? So never mind historical stuff. The history doesn't mean it's going to play out. But if you're gambling on paying jacked up prices for a hotel, taking the road trip, or paying for the flight, and it's a 60%, 50-50 chance that you're going to get clouded out, I don't know, right? You're not gaining much to go down to this area. The good place, though, it seems, ironically enough, this is what was weird to me. The lower percentage of cloud coverage is in the rainiest spot in the country, right? That's the part that I found to be strange. But again, it's time of year, it's the season, right? So the rainy season's not happening in late August. So turns out, again, maybe Oregon, Washington, that's the place you want to find yourself. Okay? Because as an astronomer, I know how bad the clouds can get, and if I want it to be cloudy on a day, all I have to say is, hey, I'm planning an observation for this time, and it'll be cloudy. So that's why I just, I take it with a grain of salt. So how can you do it safely? Never look at the sun. It's my continuous public service announcement. Never look at the sun. Okay? I tell my students, they ask me, can I look at a solar eclipse though? I say, wait, can you look at the sun? No. Can you look at a solar eclipse? No. Can you look at a moon? At the moon? Yeah. Can you look at a lunar eclipse? Sure. So if you can look at it normally, then you can look at it when it's being eclipsed. If you can't look at it normally, you can't watch it during an eclipse unless you have the proper equipment. And there are a variety of options, one of which is this sun spotter instrument, which acts like a pinhole camera, an old-fashioned pinhole camera, where this opening here, when you point at the sun, it'll shine an image right onto this nice darkened screen, and you can look at that and watch the moon, cover it entirely. You could do it any day and look at sunspots, little dark areas of cool gas that pop up here and there in the sun. But when I did a Google search to find this image to show you what it looked like, I was seeing shopping websites where this was like over $400. I don't remember it being normally that high. I know it's probably able to be found for like $100 because you have to design it right. You got to get a special piece of material for the screen so it looks nice and everything. So I understand it being a little expensive, but not $430 expensive. So that may not be the route to go. There are plenty of other options, one of which you have in your hands. Who's tried them on already? Okay. If you put those over your eyes right now, you're going to notice something. You can't see a thing. You can't see anything at all. And the reason is because it's blocking all the lights. If you were to go outside, and again, the timing is important here, put them over your eyes and then look up at the sun, and then look down and take them off, okay? You will be able to see the sun and look at it safely. You're not going to be able to see much detail. This is a really large sunspot on the face of the sun. You're not, like I say, not going to see much, other than a nice orange glowing orb, okay? But for the purposes of an eclipse where you don't need much detail, all you need to do is be able to see the moon slowly and gradually block out some of the sun. These are more than adequate. You can, if you have a telescope of your own, you can order solar filters for your telescope. Again, relatively inexpensive, but I don't know if the markup fad has reared its ugly head with this equipment yet. I know when I tried to do an observation for the transit of Venus, one of these other once-in-a-lifetime opportunities 5 years ago, I read about this technique where you could take a funnel, like an oil funnel, cut the narrow end off just to the right size, stick that into an eyepiece of a telescope, put a filter on the other end, and then order a piece of projector screen that's back illuminated, a special kind of computer screen or projector screen where you would want to shine the projector from the reverse side. Okay? Get a piece, strap it over the wide end of the funnel, and multiple people can look at it instead of waiting one at a time trying to look through the eyepiece. So I investigated it, and it was a few months in advance. Well, wouldn't you know, it was a few $100s for a 1 foot by 1 foot square of this material. I went back a month later, and it was only like $10 for it. They marked it up like so bad, because they knew people were ordering it for that specific purpose,
Price gouging.
Exactly, right? So it happens, right? Even in astronomy, for astronomy events. If you don't have a telescope of your own, there are several local astronomy organizations that might be hosting something. I do not know. Since Custer Institute, the Amateur Observer Society of New York, the Astronomical Society of Long Island. These are groups of amateur astronomers, hobbyists, who just like to observe for their own enjoyment. A lot of them, I'm sure, have been planning their trips for years. So whether or not there are going to be people even around, I don't know. But what I've done is found some contact information if you want to jot it down for yourself, or just do some Google searches on your own when you feel the time is right. And you can contact them in Montauk Observatory. It's more of a private organization that hosts public events. Sean Tavalia in our department is on the board of directors. So you could always contact him and he could get you in touch with the right people, I'm sure. So you could always contact them and say, hey, are you planning anything? Is there a public observing event that's going to be happening? And you could take them somewhere local. Okay. And I think with that, I've taken up a good amount of your time. Good. It's 12 o'clock. Does anybody have any questions? I'd be happy to address.
A little unrelated, but this past winter we had like a blood red moon.
Mm-hmm.
What caused that? Like, what causes that?
It's the same thing that happens when you have a sunrise or sunset, right? So the sun normally, midday, it's got this very white, yellowish appearance, right? But once it starts to set, from our perspective, where we stand on Earth, when you look at a sunset near the horizon, we're actually looking through a little bit more air than when we're looking up above. And because there's more air, more of that sunlight is being filtered out. And the air prefers to filter blue light, which is why the sky is blue, right? So if more blue light from the sun is filtered, it's going to leave red to come through to our eyes, so a sunset is just going to look naturally red. The moon suffers the same fate. When the moon looks blood red, it's low on the horizon. So particularly in the summer, this is a great effect over the summer. My summer classes, the students that notice this all the time, they ask me about it. During the full moons, like June, July, and August, look at it at the horizon, and it's going to look that blood red. It's going to look really deep orange. Wait 15 minutes. It'll be a little higher up. It's going to look more yellow. 15 more minutes, a little less yellow. By the time, at least an hour, once an hour has passed, it's looking normal white. And it's all because of the air filtering out those specific colors, yeah.
How often does that happen too, like with the blood?
Honestly, it happens every full moon. It happens every full moon. You just have to look at it at the right moment. Tends to happen more in
Winter, right?
happens more in summer. And the reason why is because while in the daytime the sun is high up in the sky, at night the moon tends to stay lower. And because it stays lower longer, it's red longer, it's orange longer, because of the path it's traveling, because it stays low, and that light's shining through that murkiness, right? In the wintertime, the opposite happens. The sun stays low, the moon rises high above us. So it doesn't spend as much time, so people tend not to notice it, particularly in the wintertime. But it's the summer months where people tend to see it. And it will happen when the moon sets in the morning, too. And again, very few people, unless you're our students, hanging out and partying all night, and walking home at dawn. Then they'll notice it. Okay? Yeah.
Okay, I just checked Custer's website, because my husband and I are members.
Oh, okay.
And they have no events during August. So
Okay.
basically, everybody's gone. It says their event is go plan a trip or just watch this online.
Okay. All right.
So-
Yeah.
so
And I don't know why I didn't even think to put that on there. There's so many video feeds happening across the country. I'm sure you could find a place online to watch it. That'd be an opportunity. And as it just so happens, and this dawned on me just last week, the annual golf outing that the foundation puts together is happening on August 21st. So
we're trying to figure out what the golfing rules are.
exactly right.
Everything gets a little darker.
Yeah. So it's a super honest system. I think you got to be.
I remember as a kid, there must have been some sort of solar event in the 60s or 70s. but I remember there's gonna be an eclipse. Don't look at the sun, you're gonna go blind and everybody stay inside. I remember being told that.
Yeah. Here's what I tell my students. Remember my warning from before? Don't look at the sun, don't look at an eclipse? You got that? That's etched in your brains, right? Okay. When the moon is blocking the sun entirely, logic says I should be able to look at it. And your logic is right. You can look at it. You can stare at the sun when the moon is completely covering it because you're not getting sunlight. But here's the issue. Notice the moon here gradually blocks the sun and will eventually cover it entirely. You have to know precisely when the moon is covering the sun. What time does that start? How long does it last? So when does it end? Right? Is my watch synchronized to universal time properly? Who's got the same time on all their devices in their home? Watch, phone, oven, microwave oven, VCR or DVD, like they're all off by a minute or two, right? So we kind of live life with an approximate time. You can't do that here. The reason why is, even if the moon is covering more than this, but not entirely, right? Imagine just a tiny little wedge of sunlight coming off the edge of the sun. If you're staring at it for minutes, it's doing damage to your eye. And what makes matters worse is this. If you touch a hot stove with your hand, there are things called pain receptors in your nerve endings. Signals that when you touch something hot, trigger a warning that travels through your nerves, to your spinal cord, up to your brain, relaying the message, hey dummy, this is hot, you're doing damage to your hand, you should think about moving your hand away from this thing that's burning your hand off. And your brain's like, okay, that sounds good, and it sends a signal, and you pull your hand away. How fast does that happen? Like that. What I just described is not a 5-second, 10-second dialogue. It's instant, right? Those pain receptors are not in your eyeballs. You don't have those nerve endings in your retina. So there's no message being sent to your brain, hey, stop looking at this, you're doing damage. So all the while you think you're looking at the sun being blocked entirely, there might be a tiny wedge of sunlight that's just burning the retina and causing severe damage. Is it worth the risk to glance up and say, oh, I can stare at it? It's not worth the risk. So we give the warning, like I said, and that's what I want everybody's brains, my students' brains, say, get in your brain. Don't look at it. Come to a presentation like this, get a free pair of these. Come to one of our astronomy events this past year, come get a free pair. These were going for about, okay, when we ordered these last year, about $3 or $4 each. We ordered like 50 or 100 or something like that. Okay? Whether the price is up now, I don't know. I haven't checked. But we know the history of price gouging, so just be aware of that.
$64
Okay?
on Amazon.
So, it's not worth your eyesight. Because I remember the same exact thing growing up, right? Don't look at it, you're going to go blind. The reason why is you don't want to take the risk. You don't want to take the chance. All right? Anything else? Any other questions?
Thank you.
Okay.
Fascinating.
All right.
Thank you, man.
Thank you.